The morning mist clung to Millstone's empty streets like a secret that refused to be told. This forgotten town, tucked between endless wheat fields and cracked highways, had seen better days. Its residents moved through life at the pace of molasses, content with their predictable routines and quiet existence. Nothing ever happened to Millstone. Nothing ever changed. Until he arrived. The stranger first appeared on a Tuesday, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and shadows that seemed to follow him wherever he walked. He rented the small house on Elm Street, the one with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged like a tired smile. Mrs. Henderson from next door tried to strike up a conversation over the fence, but the man just nodded politely and disappeared inside. Every morning, before the sun painted the sky pink, he would emerge from his door like a ghost materializing from another world. The hood of his gray sweatshirt pulled low, hiding his face in darkness. He moved with purpose, but where he went, nobody knew. He would vanish for hours, returning only when the streets were empty and the windows of neighboring houses glowed with the warm light of dinner time. The mystery deepened when young Tommy Martinez spotted him at Murphy's boxing gym on Main Street. The old building had seen better decades, its brick walls stained with years of sweat and dreams. Inside, the wooden floors creaked under the weight of ambition, and the heavy bags hung like ancient warriors waiting for battle. Jeremy Sloan owned the place, and he never let anyone forget it. His Olympic gold medal sat in a display case by the entrance, polished to perfection, catching the light like a beacon of his former glory. Jeremy had been somebody once. He had stood on podiums while national anthems played. He had felt the weight of gold around his neck and heard crowds chant his name. But that was 15 years ago. Now, Jeremy ruled a small kingdom with an iron fist and an ego that had only grown larger with time. He barked orders at teenagers who dreamed of greatness, criticized every punch that wasn't perfect, and reminded everyone daily that they were training under a champion. His favorite phrase was "back in my day," followed by stories that grew more impressive with each telling. The gym attracted local kids mostly, some college students, and a handful of weekend warriors trying to recapture their youth. They paid their monthly fees, nodded at Jeremy's lectures, and practiced their combinations on bags that had absorbed countless hours of hope and frustration. When the hooded stranger first walked through the doors, Jeremy barely glanced up from his conversation with Danny, a promising young heavyweight. The man approached the front desk quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked about membership rates. Sarah, the part-time receptionist, handed him the standard paperwork. "First time boxing?" she asked with genuine curiosity. The stranger paused, his hidden eyes seeming to look through her rather than at her. "Not exactly," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of untold stories. He signed the waiver with careful precision, paid the monthly fee in cash, and walked to the far corner of the gym. Without fanfare or introduction, he began wrapping his hands with the methodical patience of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Each loop, each twist, each tuck was performed with practiced ease. The other fighters couldn't help but steal glances as he approached the heavy bag. His first punch landed with a sound that made everyone pause. It wasn't the wild swinging of an amateur or the calculated strikes of a casual fitness enthusiast. This was something else entirely, something that spoke of countless hours, endless training, and a level of skill that couldn't be faked. His combinations flowed like water, each movement connected to the next in perfect harmony. Jab, cross, hook, uppercut. The bag responded to his touch like an instrument in the hands of a master musician. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary flourishes. Just pure, concentrated power delivered with surgical precision. Tommy stopped his own training to watch, his teenage eyes wide with amazement. "Who is that guy?" he whispered to his training partner Marcus. Marcus shrugged, equally mesmerized. "Never seen him before. But look at his footwork. That's not beginner stuff." Even some of the more experienced fighters found reasons to move closer, pretending to work on their own techniques while stealing glimpses of the mysterious newcomer. His shadow boxing was poetry in motion, his head movement fluid, like smoke dancing in the wind. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled those brave enough to catch a glimpse beneath the hood. They held depths that spoke of battles fought and won, of pain endured and overcome, of a past that refused to stay buried. There was something ancient in those eyes, something that had seen too much and remembered everything. Jeremy, engaged in his usual post-workout lecture about proper breathing techniques, gradually became aware of the shift in atmosphere. His students weren't paying attention anymore. Their gazes had wandered to the corner where the stranger worked in solitary focus. For the first time in years, Jeremy felt something he had almost forgotten. Curiosity mixed with a hint of unease. Who was this man who commanded attention without saying a word? What was his story? And why did his presence make Jeremy feel like his carefully constructed kingdom was suddenly standing on shaky ground? The stranger finished his session as quietly as he had begun. He unwrapped his hands with the same methodical care, nodded politely to Sarah at the front desk, and walked back into the gray afternoon, leaving behind only questions and the fading echo of perfectly executed combinations. Nobody knew his name yet, but everyone remembered his presence. In a town where nothing ever happened, something had definitely begun. Jeremy Sloan had built his identity on being the most important person in any room he entered. For 15 years, his Olympic gold medal had served as an unshakable foundation for his authority. Young fighters looked up to him. Parents trusted him with their children's dreams, and the entire community acknowledged his expertise, without question. But now, for the first time since hanging up his competitive gloves, Jeremy felt his throne wobbling. The hooded stranger had been coming to the gym for 2 weeks, and his presence had become impossible to ignore. Every day, he arrived before the morning rush, claimed his corner near the old speed bag, and proceeded to demonstrate a level of skill that made everyone else's efforts look amateurish by comparison. His routine never varied. 30 minutes of shadow boxing that looked more like a deadly dance, followed by precise work on the heavy bag, then lightning-fast combinations on the speed bag that created a rhythm so perfect it was almost hypnotic. He spoke to no one, asked for no advice, and seemed completely unaware of the growing audience that gathered to watch him train. "I'm telling you, man, I've never seen anything like it," Danny whispered to his training partner during a water break. "Watch his left hook. It's like he's barely trying, but you can hear the power behind it." The whispers were getting louder, and Jeremy was getting angrier. His usual coaching methods, which had always been effective, suddenly felt inadequate. When he corrected a student's form, they would glance toward the stranger's corner, silently comparing Jeremy's techniques to what they witnessed daily. When he shared stories from his Olympic days, eyes would wander, attention would drift, and Jeremy would find himself competing with a ghost for his students' respect. It was Marcus, the 19-year-old with dreams of going professional, who finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "Coach Jeremy," Marcus said after completing a series of combinations on the pads, "that guy in the corner, do you know who he is? His technique is incredible." Jeremy's jaw tightened. "Technique doesn't matter if you don't have heart," he replied, his voice sharp with irritation. "I've seen plenty of guys who look good on the bags, but fall apart when it matters." But even as he spoke the words, Jeremy knew they sounded hollow. There was something about the stranger that went beyond mere technique. It was in the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that radiated from every movement, the sense that he was holding back immense power rather than struggling to generate it. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when the gym was particularly crowded. Jeremy was working with Tommy on defensive techniques, emphasizing the importance of keeping hands up and chin down. As he demonstrated a blocking sequence, he noticed Tommy's attention drift toward the corner where the stranger was working. "Martinez," Jeremy snapped. "Eyes over here. This is important stuff I'm teaching you." Tommy quickly refocused, but Jeremy could see the teenager's thoughts were elsewhere. It was like trying to teach astronomy during a solar eclipse. How could anyone concentrate on basic principles when something magnificent was happening right in front of them? The stranger, oblivious to the tension he was creating, continued his workout with monk-like focus. His shadow boxing routine that morning was particularly impressive, incorporating footwork patterns that seemed to defy the laws of physics and defensive movements that made him appear untouchable. "Who does this guy think he is?" Jeremy muttered to Sarah during a brief break between sessions. Sarah, who had been watching the stranger with the same fascination as everyone else, shrugged. "He seems nice enough. Quiet, pays on time, doesn't cause any trouble. That's not what I mean, Jeremy said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He comes in here with his mysterious act, showing off with those fancy combinations, trying to make everyone else look bad. It's disrespectful. But Sarah wasn't convinced. Neither were the other regular members of the gym. If anything, the stranger's presence had elevated everyone's training. Students were arriving earlier, staying later, and pushing themselves harder. They wanted to understand what they were seeing, to learn from it, to somehow capture even a fraction of that fluid power for themselves. Jeremy's resentment grew with each passing day. He began making subtle comments during training sessions, remarks designed to undermine the stranger's growing influence, without directly confronting him. Anyone can look good when they're just dancing with the air, he would say during technique demonstrations. Real boxing happens when someone's trying to take your head off. Or while watching a student struggle with coordination. Don't worry about looking pretty like some people in here. Focus on fundamentals. Flash doesn't win fights. The stranger never responded to these indirect jabs. He seemed genuinely unaware of Jeremy's growing hostility, lost in his own world of precise movements and controlled breathing. His indifference only fueled Jeremy's anger further. The situation reached a boiling point when Mrs. Chun brought her daughter Emily to the gym for a trial session. Emily was 17, small but fierce, with dreams of competing in amateur tournaments. Jeremy had been looking forward to working with her, seeing her as another potential success story to add to his coaching resume. But from the moment Emily walked into the gym, her attention was captured entirely by the stranger in the corner. She watched his footwork with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts, her eyes following every subtle shift of weight, every perfectly timed slip and counter. "Coach Sloan," Emily said after Jeremy had finished explaining basic stance and guard position, "could you teach me to move like that guy over there?" Jeremy felt something snap inside his chest. This was his gym, his domain, his expertise being questioned by a teenager who had been there for less than an hour. The stranger hadn't said a word to Emily, hadn't offered to teach her anything, yet somehow his silent demonstration was more compelling than Jeremy's 15 years of coaching experience. "Listen, kid," Jeremy said, his voice harder than he intended. "That guy over there is all show and no substance. You want to learn real boxing, you stick with me. I've got an Olympic gold medal that says I know what I'm talking about." Emily nodded politely, but Jeremy could see the doubt in her eyes. She continued to steal glances at the stranger throughout the session, absorbing every detail of his training routine. That night, Jeremy lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with frustration and wounded pride. He had worked too hard to build his reputation, to let some mysterious newcomer undermine everything he had accomplished. Something had to be done. He didn't know who the hooded stranger was, where he had come from, or what he wanted. But Jeremy was certain of one thing. This silent challenge to his authority could not continue. The time for subtle comments and indirect confrontation was over. Tomorrow, he would make his move. Tomorrow, he would remind everyone who really owned this gym. The stranger's days of peaceful training were about to come to an end. Friday morning arrived with an electric tension that seemed to pulse through the gym's walls. Jeremy had spent the entire night planning his confrontation, rehearsing the words that would finally put the mysterious stranger in his place. This was his moment to reclaim the respect and authority that had been slowly eroding over the past 3 weeks. The stranger entered at his usual time, just as the first rays of sunlight began filtering through the gym's dusty windows. He nodded politely to Sarah at the front desk, made his way to his familiar corner, and began his ritual of hand wrapping with the same methodical precision that had become his trademark. But today, Jeremy was ready for him. "Hold up there, old-timer," Jeremy called out, his voice carrying across the gym with deliberate volume. Several early morning trainees looked up from their warm-up routines, sensing that something different was about to happen. The stranger paused in his hand wrapping, his hidden eyes lifting slightly toward Jeremy's direction, but he didn't respond. The silence stretched between them like a tightening rope. Jeremy strutted across the gym floor, his chest puffed with false confidence. "I said hold up. You deaf or something?" Still no response. The stranger resumed wrapping his left hand with infuriating calm. You know, Jeremy continued, his voice growing louder and nastier, I've been watching you for weeks now. Coming in here with your little show-off routine. Dancing around like you're something special. But I got news for you, Grandpa. This isn't your personal practice studio. This is a serious boxing gym. A few more members had stopped their workouts to watch the confrontation unfold. Tommy and Marcus exchanged worried glances from across the room. Emily, who had joined the gym the previous week, watched with a mixture of fascination and concern. The stranger finished wrapping his hands and slowly stood up. For the first time since arriving in Millstone, he turned to face Jeremy directly. Even with his hood up, his presence seemed to fill the space between them. You got something to say to me? Jeremy pressed, stepping closer. Or are you just gonna stand there like a statue? What's with the hood anyway? You hiding something under there? Bald spot? Scars? Afraid people might see what you really look like. The gym had fallen completely silent now. Even the rhythmic thudding of heavy bags had stopped as every person present focused on the tension building in front of them. Jeremy was in his element now, feeding off the attention, his ego demanding complete domination. Let me guess, you used to fight, right? Back in the Stone Age? Well, let me tell you something, Fossil. This is the modern era. Your old-school tricks don't impress anyone here. We've got real fighters, real technique, real champions. He gestured broadly at his gold medal display, his voice dripping with condescension. See that? That's what real boxing looks like. Not whatever prehistoric nonsense you're doing over in your corner. The stranger remained perfectly still, his breathing steady and controlled. His lack of reaction only fueled Jeremy's anger. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too scared to admit that you're nothing but a washed-up has-been who can't let go of the past. Jeremy was building toward his crescendo now, his voice rising with each word. I'll bet you were never even that good to begin with. Probably just some local tough guy who thinks shadowboxing makes him dangerous. Well, this is my gym. These are my students, and I don't need some mysterious nobody coming in here and... He never finished the sentence. The stranger reached up with both hands and slowly pulled back his hood. The reaction was instantaneous and electric. Gasps echoed throughout the gym like a chain reaction. Tommy's water bottle slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. Marcus took an involuntary step backward. Emily's eyes widened until they seemed to take up half her face. Oh my God, someone whispered. That's Mike Tyson. The most recognizable face in boxing history stood before them, calm and patient as a mountain. The legendary jawline, the intense eyes that had stared down every heavyweight champion of his era, the presence that had once commanded the attention of the entire world. It was all unmistakably real. Jeremy's mouth fell open, his prepared insults dying in his throat. For a moment, he looked like a man who had just discovered he'd been mocking thunder. But Jeremy's ego was too massive to be defeated by reality. After the initial shock wore off, his expression hardened into something uglier than before. Well, he said, his voice now carrying a different kind of venom. Mike Tyson, the great Mike Tyson, slumming it in our little gym. What's wrong, champ? Vegas not treating you right anymore. Had to come hide out in Nowheresville. The gym remained frozen in horrified fascination. No one could believe what they were witnessing. A small-time coach with delusions of grandeur attempting to humiliate one of the greatest fighters in history. Jeremy circled around Mike like a predator, his confidence returning as he fed off his own words. Let me ask you something, Iron Mike. What are you really doing here? Running from something? Trying to relive your glory days? Because from where I stand, all I see is a broken-down old man who can't accept that his time is over. Mike's expression never changed. He stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, radiating a kind of calm that was somehow more intimidating than any display of anger could have been. You want to know what I think? Jeremy continued, emboldened by Mike's silence. I think you're scared. Scared that if you actually try to fight someone, you'd get exposed. All that legendary reputation would crumble, and everyone would see what you really are, just another washed-up fighter living in the past. The cruelty in Jeremy's voice was becoming obvious to everyone present. Several gym members looked away, embarrassed by their coach's behavior. But Jeremy was too far gone to notice their disapproval. "So what do you say, champ?" Jeremy spread his arms wide, his voice dripping with false bravado. "You want to show these kids what a real fighter looks like? Or are you too old, too slow, too scared to prove you still got something left in that ancient body of yours?" Mike looked around the gym slowly, taking in the faces of every person watching. His gaze lingered on Emily, on Tommy, on Marcus, young fighters whose dreams were being tarnished by their coach's toxic behavior. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "You really want to do this?" Jeremy's grin was sharp and ugly. "Oh, I really want to do this." Mike nodded once, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible. "Then we'll do this." The entire gym seemed to inhale and hold its breath. In that moment, everyone understood that they were about to witness something extraordinary, something that would be remembered long after the echoes of the final bell had faded into silence. The legend was about to remind the world why legends never truly die. The transformation in the gym's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Word of the impending confrontation spread through Millstone faster than wildfire. Within an hour, the modest boxing facility was packed beyond capacity with faces that had never set foot inside its walls before. Local shop owners closed their businesses early. High school students skipped their afternoon classes. Even the elderly residents who normally spent their days on park benches made the journey to witness what many sensed would be a moment of boxing history. Mike Tyson stood in his corner of the ring, pulling on a pair of well-worn gloves with the same methodical care he had shown during his weeks of silent training. He had removed his hoodie, revealing a physique that, while carrying the marks of time, still radiated the coiled power that had once terrorized the heavyweight division. Across from him, Jeremy bounced on his toes with nervous energy, his earlier bravado beginning to crack under the weight of reality. The gold medal around his neck suddenly felt heavier, a reminder that his Olympic achievements, impressive as they were, existed in a completely different universe from the man he was about to face. "This is insane," Tommy whispered to Marcus as they pressed against the ring apron. "We're about to watch Mike Tyson fight our coach." Emily stood near the front, her notebook forgotten in her hands, her eyes fixed on Mike with an expression of pure awe. She had studied his fights on YouTube countless times, but seeing the legend in person, preparing for battle just feet away, was something entirely different. Sarah had called her manager, who had called the local newspaper, who had somehow gotten word to a regional sports blogger. By the time the impromptu match was set to begin, dozens of phone cameras were pointed toward the ring, ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. The rules, such as they were, had been hastily established. 3 rounds, amateur style with headgear and larger gloves. No official referee, just Danny volunteering to keep time and ensure basic safety. Most importantly, this wasn't meant to be a real fight, just a sparring session that had gotten out of hand. But everyone in the room could feel the underlying tension. This was about more than boxing technique or physical conditioning. This was about respect, humility, and the settling of accounts that had been building for weeks. Jeremy touched gloves with Mike in the center of the ring, but his grip lingered a moment too long, his eyes searching for any sign of weakness or uncertainty in the legend's face. He found none. The improvised bell rang, Danny banging a wrench against an old radiator, and Jeremy immediately launched into action. He had trained for this moment his entire life, even if he hadn't realized it. Every drill, every sparring session, every technique he had mastered was now being called upon to serve him in the most important 3 minutes of his boxing career. Jeremy's game plan was smart and disciplined. He used his reach advantage, staying on the outside, peppering Mike with jabs and straight rights while dancing away from any potential counterattacks. His footwork was excellent, his timing sharp, his technique fundamentally sound. For the first 90 seconds, Jeremy actually looked like he belonged in the ring with a legend. Mike, meanwhile, seemed content to observe. He moved with an almost casual fluidity, slipping punches by the narrowest of margins, occasionally throwing a lazy jab that Jeremy easily avoided. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like the older fighter was struggling to keep up with his younger, more active opponent. But those who truly understood boxing saw something different. They saw Mike studying, learning, measuring distances, and timing with the patient calculation of a master craftsman. Every one of Jeremy's attacks was being cataloged and analyzed. "He's not even trying yet," Emily whispered, her voice filled with amazement. Then, with 30 seconds left in the first round, Mike decided he had seen enough. The change was subtle at first, a slight adjustment in his stance, a barely perceptible shift in the rhythm of his movement. But Jeremy felt it immediately. The jabs that had been landing cleanly suddenly found nothing but air. The straight rights that had been connecting with Mike's gloves were now sliding past his head, like water around a stone. Jeremy pressed forward, sensing that something had changed, but not understanding what. He threw a sharp 1-2 combination, followed by a left hook that should have caught Mike moving into range. Mike wasn't there. The hook sailed harmlessly past Mike's head as he slipped to the inside, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, Jeremy found himself completely exposed. Mike could have ended the fight right there with a single uppercut or body shot. Instead, he simply smiled and stepped back, allowing Jeremy to recover his balance and defensive position. The message was clear. I could have finished this any time I wanted. The bell ended the first round with Jeremy breathing hard and Mike looking like he had just completed a light warm-up routine. As they returned to their corners, the gym buzzed with excited conversation. "Did you see how fast he moved?" someone whispered. "Jeremy's in trouble," another voice added. The second round began with Jeremy attempting to reassert his earlier dominance, but now Mike began to show flashes of his legendary offensive arsenal. Not at full power. This was still meant to be a controlled sparring session, but enough to remind everyone why he had once been the most feared puncher in the world. A jab that moved faster than the eye could follow. A right hand that stopped just short of Jeremy's chin with devastating implications. Footwork that made a man in his 50s look like he was floating on air. Jeremy tried to match the increased pace, but it was like trying to keep up with a master musician while still learning to play scales. Every combination he threw was answered with something more precise, more efficient, more beautiful. By the end of the second round, sweat was pouring down Jeremy's face, while Mike looked like he could continue for another hour without breaking a sweat. The third round was when Mike decided to provide the education that Jeremy so desperately needed. It wasn't violent or cruel. It was simply a demonstration of the vast difference between very good and truly great. Mike began to move with the fluid grace that had made him a global icon, showing combinations that existed in a realm beyond ordinary human capability. Jeremy found himself being moved around the ring like a chess piece, always reactive, never able to dictate the flow of the action. He wasn't being hurt, but he was being completely outclassed in a way that made his Olympic credentials seem like participation trophies. The final 30 seconds were pure artistry. Mike threw a series of combinations that existed somewhere between boxing and ballet, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next, creating patterns of motion that were almost hypnotic to watch. When the final bell rang, Jeremy stood in the center of the ring, breathing heavily, his face flushed with exertion and something that looked very much like revelation. Mike walked over and embraced him gently, the gesture carrying no mockery or triumph, just the acknowledgement that they had shared something special. The gym erupted in applause, but it wasn't celebration of victory or defeat. It was appreciation for having witnessed mastery in its purest form. Jeremy removed his glove slowly, his hands shaking slightly. When he finally looked up at the crowd, his expression had changed completely. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something much more valuable: humility. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the gym. "You have just watched greatness. Real greatness. And I have a lot of apologies to make." In that moment, Jeremy Sloan began the most important journey of his life. The journey from being a champion to becoming a teacher. 3 months had passed since the day that changed everything at Murphy's boxing gym. The incident, as people in Millstone had come to call it, had rippled through the small town, like a stone thrown into still water, creating waves that touched every corner of the community. Mike Tyson had stayed. That decision surprised everyone, including Mike himself. He had come to Millstone seeking nothing more than anonymity and peace, planning to disappear back into the shadows once his presence was discovered. But something about the aftermath of that impromptu sparring session had touched something deep within him, something he thought he had lost forever. The gym had been transformed. Where once there had been an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, now there was respect and genuine learning. Jeremy had kept his word about apologizing, but more importantly, he had completely reimagined his approach to coaching. Gone were the days of berating students for imperfect technique or boasting about his own accomplishments. Instead, Jeremy approached each training session with the humility of a student, often asking Mike for guidance on how to better serve the young fighters who trusted them with their dreams. The relationship between the two men had evolved into something neither had expected, a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Jeremy had learned to channel his competitive fire into building up others rather than tearing them down. Mike had rediscovered his love for the sport that had given him everything and taken so much away. Emily Chun had become the shining example of what the new gym culture could produce. Under the combined guidance of Jeremy's technical expertise and Mike's psychological wisdom, she had developed into a formidable amateur boxer with legitimate professional potential. But more than her physical skills, Emily had absorbed the deeper lessons that both men had learned through their own struggles. She fought with controlled aggression, treated opponents with respect, and understood that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the discipline to protect and inspire. "Boxing saved my life," Mike told her one afternoon as they worked on defensive combinations. "But it also nearly destroyed me. The goal isn't to avoid the destruction, it's to learn from it and help others avoid the same mistakes." Emily nodded, her young mind processing wisdom that usually took decades to acquire. "Is that why you stayed? To help people like me?" Mike considered the question carefully. "I stayed because I realized I wasn't finished yet. Not with boxing, and not with life. Sometimes the most important fights happen outside the ring." The transformation extended beyond individual relationships. The gym had become a hub for the entire community, attracting visitors from neighboring towns who came to witness the unlikely partnership between a legend and a former rival who had learned to become something greater than what he was before. Local businesses began sponsoring equipment and training camps. The mayor organized a charity event featuring exhibitions between regional amateur teams. Parents who had never set foot in a boxing gym found themselves volunteering to help with youth programs. Tommy and Marcus, now seniors in high school, had both earned college scholarships, Tommy for academics and Marcus for boxing. They credited not just their improved skills, but the life lessons they had absorbed from watching two men overcome their past mistakes and build something beautiful from the wreckage of their former selves. The most remarkable change, however, was visible in Mike himself. The haunted quality that had followed him for years began to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his early 20s. He discovered that teaching young fighters wasn't just about technique or tactics. It was about helping them understand themselves. "The hardest opponent you'll ever face is the person in the mirror," he would tell his students. "Master that fight, and everything else becomes manageable." On a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring, the gym hosted its first official amateur tournament. Fighters from across the state had come to compete, drawn by the reputation of the transformed facility and the opportunity to train, even briefly, with boxing royalty. As Mike watched Emily compete in the championship bout of her weight class, he felt a pride that had nothing to do with victory or defeat. She fought with precision and heart, showing respect for her opponent even as she systematically dismantled her defensive strategy. When Emily's hand was raised in victory, the applause that filled the gym wasn't just for her technical achievement. It was recognition of what she represented, proof that talent nurtured with wisdom and respect could produce something truly special. Later that evening, as the last of the visitors departed and the equipment was stored away, Mike and Jeremy sat in the empty gym, sharing a quiet moment of satisfaction. "You know," Jeremy said, "I spent 15 years thinking that gold medal made me special, but I was never as proud of anything as I am of what we've built here." Mike smiled, expression that came much easier to him these days. "That's because the medal was about you. This is about something bigger." Jeremy nodded, understanding completely. They had both learned that true greatness wasn't measured in personal achievements, but in the lives they touched and the positive changes they could inspire in others. Outside, Millstone settled into another peaceful evening, its residents unaware that their small town had become something special. They had witnessed the kind of transformation that reminded everyone that redemption was always possible, that people could change, and that sometimes the most important victories happened long after the final bell had rung. In the years that followed, Murphy's boxing gym would become legendary in amateur boxing circles, not for producing champions, but for producing character. Students would come from across the country to train under the guidance of two men who had learned that the greatest strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to build. And Mike Tyson, who had come to Millstone seeking nothing more than a place to hide from his past, had instead found something far more valuable, a future worth fighting for. The legend had finally come home. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not in the ring, but in the quiet moments when we choose to become better than we were. True champions aren't made by their ability to defeat others, but by their courage to confront themselves and their willingness to lift others up along the way.